Hey everybody, John the Other here, obviously. And I want to talk briefly today about Prime Minister Justin Zoolander, or as some people very insultingly call him, Trudeau. Now, among the people who watch my videos and maybe watch anti-feminist videos or MGTOW videos, libertarian videos, even conservative videos, Trudeau is pretty widely a subject of derisive scorn and mockery and contempt, and I think deservedly so. He's done a number of things which definitely call for him to be treated with scorn and contempt. He's killed a very large number of very large Canadian industry infrastructure projects, negatively impacting the Canadian economy. He's demonstrated a continuous scorn and contempt for Western Canada. He has said there's no such thing as Canadian culture, although he kind of gives the lie to that by a policy of immigration which seems to be designed to destroy Canadian culture. He has given tens of millions of dollars to terrorists and murderers. He has, in fact, had a program running to reintegrate Canadian citizens who left Canada to become ISIS combatants, which means go and murder, burn people alive, rape, murder gay people. And his program is to reintegrate them back into Canada with no oversight, no police intervention, no tracking. So there's at least 60 people, Canadian citizens, who left the country to go join ISIS, and Trudeau called them adventure tourists or Islamic travelers or something. And they're just back in Canadian cities and communities with no oversight. Fantastic. And the completely wildly irresponsible policy of mass immigration with no program for integrating anybody into Canadian society or acculturate them to Canadian values or whatnot. I mean, there's lots of things you can point at and get outraged about, and I don't really want to talk about any of them today. I want to talk about something that on its surface seems more mild, but I believe is actually much worse. And that's the announcement by Trudeau's Liberals, Trudeau himself, that his party is going to pass a law that makes housing a human right. Now, in order to explain why I find this so bothersome, I think I need to talk briefly about what is a human right and what's a civil right, or, differently stated, what's a positive right and what's a negative right. Things like free speech, freedom of mobility, freedom of association, those I would call civil rights, but I would also call them negative rights. And they're negative because they're prohibitions against the government, or any government, interfering with you, the private citizens, exercise of any of those rights. You have the right to freedom of speech. The government cannot come and stop you from speaking. Well, except that they now can. So when I say the government can't, what I'm speaking of is hypothetically when you have that as a legal right, a civil right. You have the right to freedom of association. They can't tell you who you can and can't, or who you have to associate with. You are free to associate with who you want to. You have the freedom of mobility. You can go where you want to go. You can go to Alberta, you can go to Ontario, etc. These are civil rights because the government is barred from interfering with your ability to exercise those rights, or we call them negative rights. Positive rights, on the other hand, are typically called human rights, and those are typically entitlements, like you have the right to provision of healthcare. If we encode healthcare legally as a human right, then it's a positive right because it's give me free stuff, or give this group free stuff. Of course, there is no free stuff. It's always stuff provided through forcible theft. So governments love human rights, and they love human rights because human rights are positive entitlements typically for groups, and they allow the government, they enable and justify the government to enlarge the scope of activities and take money from people or use force to move people around or steal and redistribute them, create jobs for bureaucrats. So positive rights, human rights, governments love them. Negative rights, or civil rights, governments don't love those so much because those limit what the government can do. So I'm a big proponent of civil rights, which is to say negative, and I'm a big detractor. I don't like human rights, which allows governments to use force and steal. So if housing is a human right, what that means, if we are to interpret that philosophically, is that the government is going to provide housing for everybody. Now, economically, it's untenable. It's completely insane. And Trudeau's Liberals have said they're going to devote $40 billion to public housing. That's expansion of the scope of government, but it's not enough to house everybody. So really what we're going to see is preferred victim groups being given special access to money. So what we're doing is creating a tiered society. Certain people are above others based on their level of entitlement. But the more worrying thing is, philosophically, if we as a society decide that housing is a human right, what we have just decided is that the government is going to expand to encompass everything in our society, which is the logical definition of fascism. Everything in the culture within the government, nothing outside the government. That's what fascism actually is. So housing as a human right is not a small step, it's a big step on the road to fascism. But it's not all bad. One of the reasons it's not all bad is that most people don't know the difference between a positive and a negative right. They don't know the difference between a human right and a civil right. They use those two terms interchangeably. That's good news, because it might be that after some wrangling and fighting in Parliament over whatever law they tried to draft, that this becomes articulated as a civil right, which would mean if housing is a civil right rather than a human right, then instead of it being free stuff, title for the government to go steal more money from the public to provide housing to preferred groups, instead, if it's a civil right, then the government cannot interfere with your private individual right to obtain and secure housing for yourself, which would mean a relaxation on rules that prevent people from increasing the supply of housing, which right now is a really, really big problem in Canada. And there is a little bit of positive news if you look at Canadian case law. There's a site called Canley, and I'm not going to expect everybody to go look this up. I will put some links in the low bar. There's a large number of cases that have gone through the Canadian courts where people who are homeless or close to homeless or marginally homeless have housed themselves in improvised structures and tents on Crown land, typically in parks in groups. And a number of municipalities have attempted to use court orders to evict these people from Crown lands, from parks when they're homeless, when you have a large gathering of people putting up tents and living in a park because they don't have anywhere else to go. And it has been determined repeatedly in Canadian courts that municipalities do not have the right to evict Canadian citizens living in tents in parks in Crown land. This establishes a legal precedent. This is the case law. So let's say that in the confusion of language, the words human rights and civil rights are just being used stupidly interchangeably. Let's assume, or let's actually push for, this to be articulated as a civil right, allowing people to secure their own housing, relaxing some of the regulations and some of the bureaucracy that prevents people from actualizing and creating their own housing. Allow the market to start filling the need for housing. Now, before I wrap this up, a couple of other things. I occasionally get people messaging me through the messaging system, asking me if I'll address a particular topic in a video, and usually it's weeks later by the time I get back to those messages, because I never remember to check them, and then they're gone and we never talk. So if you want me to do a video on a particular topic, send me an email, and I'll put my email in the low bar here. Additionally, the other issue is demonetization and shutting down of conservative, libertarian, and anti-feminist viewpoints seems to be a growing concern for a large number of people, particularly demonetization of videos. Now, my channel has for a long time been a YouTube partner channel, and I, for a period of time, ran ads on my channel, but I was never able to actually collect any of the income from those ads because their way of allowing that seemed to be very broken, so I stopped running ads on my channel. But if you do want to see more content on this channel and you want to see me spend more time doing the videos and more research and so on, Patreon is how you can help me do that. Anyway, thanks very much for watching, and as always, have a lovely day.